In the last video, we talked about decimals and how decimals can be broken up, a whole number can be broken up into smaller amounts. Sometimes we put that amount in fraction form, other times we write it in decimal form. And a decimal point is placed between the ones column, to the right of the ones column, and before you write your decimal number. So in this case, if you had a whole broken up into 10 equal parts, you would have, and 4 of them were shaded, you would have 4/10ths of the parts shaded in. It sounds just like it does when we say it as a fraction. 4/10ths is the same as 4/10ths. So we would write 0 in the whole number because we don't have a whole number in this problem. We would put our decimal point, and then we would put the 4 here under the tenths column. Now you notice here we haven't used this column. This is another column called the hundredths. Now in these examples we had a whole broken up into 10 equal parts, but sometimes the parts can be broken up into even smaller pieces, which are called in this case, we have 10 groups of 10 to make 100 little squares. When I counted the squares, I have 2 full rows of 10 plus 6 more squares here shaded in. So I have 26 out of 100 squares shaded in. When I write that as a decimal, it sounds just the way it sounds when I write it as a fraction. We would say this as 26 hundredths. And when I would write this, I would write it as 26, just like the number says, 2/10ths, 6 hundredths. And then I would put the decimal point in front of the 2. So down here we are going to do the same thing. I have 7 rows of 10 shaded in plus 7 ones. So that equals 77 out of 100 squares shaded in. When I write this into my decimal place value chart, I know I don't have a whole number, so I'm going to put a 0 there. I'm going to put a decimal point here, and to the right of that I have 7 rows of tenths, and then I have each one of these little squares represents 100 because it takes 100 of them to fill this grid. And I have 7 hundredths. So this would be read again as 77 hundredths. When you read the number, you use the label of wherever the last digit falls. So here, 77 hundredths. Down here, this one is almost full. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 full rows of the tenths, right? Out of 100, I have 8 full rows shaded in, plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 85 out of 100, or 85 hundredths. When I would write this down, I'd write my 0 in the whole number. I'd fill in my decimal point, and again, I would write it just as it sounds. 85, and because it's got 100 in the denominator, I would end in the hundredths place value. So I would read this as 85 hundredths, just like the fraction is. Finally, sometimes you'll have a very small amount, like these 2 hundredths. It's almost like you had 2 pennies. If somebody asks you do you have any change? And you say, I have 2 cents, right? Here, you have 2 squares filled in out of 100 squares. So you know that's a small amount. So you'd have 2 out of 100. If I were to write this as a decimal, this is a little tricky. Again, I'm going to put my 0 in the whole number, and I'm going to put my decimal point where it belongs, right to the right of the ones column. Then, because I'm reading this as 2 hundredths, I need to make sure I put the 2 under the hundredths column. So that goes to the right. So the 2 is going to go here. Notice this empty space. I cannot leave an empty space. So I'm going to fill that with a 0. So 2 hundredths looks like this, 0.02. And again, it's like you'd have 2 cents.